It started with a pounding on the door so hard it shook the frame. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. It demands obedience. The morning had been calm, a thin layer of sunlight spilling over the porch, coffee still steaming in my hand. But that peace shattered the moment I heard her voice. "Open up! HOA enforcement!" It wasn't law enforcement protocol. It was aggression. It was theater. Through the narrow gap of the curtain, I saw two men standing in uniform, badges flashing, postures stiff. But even from behind the glass, something didn't add up. Their boots didn't match. The badges didn't glint like real metal. And behind them, standing with that unshakable air of superiority, was HOA Karen. The queen of entitlement herself, in her 50s but still dressing like she had power to prove. She stood there with her clipboard like a sword, chin lifted, smirk locked in place. The kind of smirk that said, "I've already won." Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I opened the door halfway, calm as ever. She loved to think she could rattle me, but I'd worked in federal operations long enough to know how to spot intimidation. "What's this about?" I asked evenly. Karen crossed her arms, her diamond bracelet flashing in the light like a badge of her own. "You're in violation again," she said, her tone syrupy but venomous underneath. "And these officers are here to handle it." The taller one stepped forward and flashed his badge just long enough for me to see the edges. My stomach tightened. The numbers were scratched out. The font wasn't standard issue. I leaned forward slightly. "Which department are you with?" He stiffened, eyes narrowing. "Don't question authority," he barked, voice breaking mid-sentence. Karen tilted her head behind him, smug as ever. "Just let them do their job." That's when my wife's footsteps echoed down the hall, calm, deliberate, unhurried. She appeared behind me like a shadow stepping into daylight, her presence quiet but commanding. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a jacket, hair tied back. But her demeanor was sharper than any badge they carried. The fake officers turned to her instinctively, their confidence wilting. She didn't say a word. She simply reached into her jacket, flipped open her credentials, and let the silence do the talking. Real federal authority gleamed in her hand, stamped, sealed, and very real. In that instant, the entire porch froze, the air went thin, the fake cops went pale. And for the first time since I'd known her, Karen lost her smile. My wife spoke softly, each word slicing through the tension. "You want to play pretend? Let's see how far you get." Her voice was calm, not raised, not aggressive, just surgically cold. The shorter of the two imposters stammered, "Ma'am, this isn't what it looks like." She tilted her head slightly, letting the badge catch the sunlight. "You're impersonating law enforcement," she said. "That's a federal offense." Karen's voice cracked. I didn't know they were fake," she said, her eyes darting between them. But we could both see it. The panic behind her eyes wasn't guilt. It was exposure. She'd been caught, and her illusion of control was crumbling fast. Then, the moment that sealed her fate, the two fake cops bolted. No warning. No excuse. They turned and sprinted down the walkway like scared animals, their boots thudding against the concrete. Karen spun after them, shrieking, "Wait, don't leave me here!" But they didn't look back. The porch fell quiet again, except for the sound of her shallow breathing. My wife lowered her badge and spoke with absolute calm. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Karen froze, her confidence dissolving. I'd seen cartel members, executives, and crooked agents face interrogation before, but nothing compared to watching HOA Karen realize she was in over her head. Her kingdom of paperwork and threats had finally met a force she couldn't out-talk: federal law. Karen tried to recover her tone, stumbling over her own lies. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice trembling. My wife didn't move an inch. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, stepping closer. "You sent men pretending to be police officers to our door. That's not confusion, that's conspiracy." Karen's eyes darted, desperate for a way to rewrite reality. "I was just enforcing community regulations," she said, louder this time, like volume could erase guilt. I stepped in now, my voice steady, low, final. "Karen, I'm not even part of your HOA. You've known that for years." Her mask broke, the arrogance vanished, replaced by the flicker of panic. "Everyone in this area falls under our jurisdiction," she snapped, voice cracking. My wife gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's funny," she said, "because federal property records disagree." She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen. On it glowed a map, official government survey data showing exactly where the HOA's authority ended, 2 miles short of our land. "See that line?" she said. "That's where your power ends. You stepped over it the moment you walked onto this porch." Karen looked like she'd been punched. "You can't talk to me like that," she said, voice shaking. "I have rights, too." I almost pitied her. "So did we," I said, "until you tried to take them." My wife raised her phone again, pressing a button this time, and what played next silenced everything. The screen showed the feed from our hidden porch camera. Crystal clear video of Karen standing in the driveway minutes earlier, handing those fake cops their badges, her voice audible as she said, "Make it look official." Karen went pale, eyes wide, face slack. You recorded that?" she whispered. My wife smiled coldly. "Federal surveillance doesn't miss much." Karen's instinct was to lunge for the phone, but I blocked her path. "You're done, Karen." She backed away, voice trembling. "You wouldn't dare press charges." My wife didn't raise her voice. "Watch me." For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, Karen didn't have words. No rules, no clauses, no forms to hide behind, just silence and the sound of reality closing in. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her clipboard, still pretending to have control, but the performance was over. My wife took a step closer, calm and merciless. "You think fear gives you power. It doesn't. Truth does." That's when the flash of red and blue lit up the windows. The real police were already pulling into the driveway. The same homeowners she used to threaten were stepping onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. The HOA queen, who once fined them for mailbox paint, was about to be escorted away in handcuffs. And as the reflection of the cruiser lights spread across Karen's face, I saw it. The exact second she realized that for the first time in her life, she'd met someone she couldn't bully. And standing next to me, coffee still warm, badge still glinting, my wife didn't even smile. She didn't need to. The law had already spoken. The illusion of power had finally collapsed, and the silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was justice. The morning after the takedown felt unreal. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens when fear finally leaves a place. I stood on the porch, watching the sunlight crawl across the yard that had been at the center of Karen's war for control. The air felt lighter, the silence deeper, almost cleansing. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and inside, my wife was already back to her routine, calm and composed as ever, as if she hadn't just dismantled a false power structure in a single night. I remember looking at her, realizing that the people Karen tried to intimidate never stood a chance, because she wasn't up against another homeowner. She was up against the law itself. And that law was wearing jeans and a ponytail. The local news picked it up faster than I expected. HOA president arrested after sending fake officers to resident's home. The headline spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once looked away when Karen strutted down the street with her clipboard were now sending apology texts. The same people who had feared her fines and fake authority were suddenly finding their voices again. One by one, they started coming forward, sharing their own stories of harassment. Fines for flags, warnings for porch lights, violations for mailboxes that weren't aesthetic. For years, Karen's tyranny had gone unchecked, and now that she'd fallen, the whole rotten structure was collapsing with her. By that afternoon, investigators had already started collecting statements. My wife coordinated quietly with the lead detective, transferring the footage, logging timestamps, listing evidence, her professionalism cold and flawless. The officers were polite but cautious. It wasn't every day they found themselves working alongside someone who could quote federal code without checking notes. When they left, they thanked her for the footage, for her clarity, for keeping her composure when most people would have panicked. She simply nodded, poured another cup of coffee and said, "It's just protocol." But I saw the glint in her eyes, the satisfaction of seeing justice done right. Karen, on the other hand, was crumbling in real time. Within 48 hours, her mugshot was circulating online. That trademark smirk was gone, replaced by confusion and exhaustion. The HOA board, desperate to protect themselves, issued a public statement claiming they had no prior knowledge of her actions. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The residents called an emergency vote, and by the end of the week, the HOA board was dissolved. No more fake rules, no more letters, no more threats written in bold red ink. The whole neighborhood took a collective breath for the first time in years. I watched it all unfold like clockwork, one domino falling after another. Karen's director, Mr. Thompson, the so-called HOA authority who ordered her to enforce compliance, was exposed as a conman running multiple shell HOAs across the county. My wife's agency took over his investigation, revealing a trail of fraud, forged permits, and tax manipulation. What started as one neighborhood scandal turned into a full-blown federal case. Ironic, considering Karen once bragged about having friends in enforcement. The only friend she had left now was her public defender. But the real turning point wasn't the arrest or the press release. It was the look on people's faces when they realized they'd been living under a lie. I'll never forget seeing Mr. Lawson, the retired veteran from down the street, standing at his fence the next morning. He'd been one of Karen's favorite targets, fined repeatedly for flying the American flag without permission. He walked up to me, shook my hand, and said, "About time someone stood up to her." His voice cracked when he added, "Didn't think anyone would?" That hit harder than I expected, because in a way Karen had created a system where everyone thought they were alone, until the illusion broke. That evening, my wife and I sat outside again, the same porch where it had all started. She leaned back in her chair, quiet for a long time, then said, "You know what the sad part is? She really thought she was untouchable." I nodded, staring at the road where the cruiser had taken Karen away. "That's the thing about power," I said. "The fake kind always runs when the real kind shows up." She smiled faintly, just enough for the porch light to catch it. "You should write that down." The days that followed were the calmest we'd had in years. No more HOA letters in the mailbox. No more strangers on the property. The grass grew tall again, and no one cared. Freedom, it turned out, didn't look like rebellion. It looked like silence. My wife started keeping the badge mounted near the front door, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what real authority means. It wasn't about rank or titles. It was about restraint. Karen used fear to control people. My wife used truth to end her. And when truth wins, it doesn't need to scream. It just stands there, unshakable, letting the lies burn themselves out. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the county attorney's office. It confirmed what we already knew. Karen had pled guilty to impersonation, conspiracy, and fraud. She'd taken a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. The HOA she'd built like her personal empire was officially dissolved. Every resident she'd wronged was reimbursed. Every fraudulent fine was voided. And in the final twist of irony, the HOA's remaining funds, over $70,000, were seized by the state as part of a restitution order. The woman who spent years fining people for petty aesthetic violations had her own life stripped down to the bare minimum. That night, I took the letter outside and read it under the same porch light that once illuminated her smug face. My wife joined me, 2 mugs of coffee in hand, as always. "Feels different now," I said. She nodded. "That's because it's over." The crickets hummed softly in the dark, and for the first time, peace didn't feel temporary. It felt permanent. I looked at the horizon, at the faint glow of the town lights beyond the trees, and thought about every person who'd ever been pushed around by someone like Karen. Maybe they'd see this story or hear about it and realize they didn't have to be silent anymore. Because that's the truth about people like her. They build their power on silence. And when silence ends, so does their control. My wife leaned her head against my shoulder, the air cool and clean around us. "You know," she said quietly, "she sent cops to scare us." I smiled. "Yeah." She sipped her coffee. "And all it took was one real badge to make them run." And just like that, the story that began with chaos ended in quiet. No more sirens, no more threats, just the steady hum of night and the unshakable comfort of knowing that justice had already spoken. By the end of that week, the fallout from Karen's downfall had rippled across the entire county. What started as one HOA president's power trip had turned into a multi-agency case study on fraud, intimidation, and abuse of authority. The local paper called it the HOA implosion, but the truth ran deeper than headlines could capture. People who'd lived in fear for years were finally speaking out. Every story had the same rhythm: threats, fines, humiliation, and all of it traced back to Karen's obsession with control. The woman who once claimed to uphold community standards had built her own empire of deceit, and it was crumbling piece by piece. My wife, ever the professional, kept her tone measured when agents called for updates, but I could tell she took pride in every domino that fell. Justice, for her, wasn't emotional. It was structural, precise. The HOA's records, once locked away behind Karen's authority, became public during the investigation. It was worse than anyone expected. Dozens of fraudulent citations, illegal fund diversions, even a fake maintenance contract that funneled money into Karen's personal account. For years, she had convinced everyone that she was indispensable, that the HOA couldn't function without her. Now those same people were seeing her for what she truly was, a fraud dressed in floral blazers and false authority. Neighbors who had been too afraid to stand up to her began organizing meetings, not HOA meetings, but community gatherings without titles or penalties. The same cul-de-sacs that once echoed with Karen's shrill reprimands, now filled with laughter, music, and the sound of people remembering what freedom felt like. I watched from our porch as families began reclaiming their own homes, repainting fences in colors Karen had once forbidden, planting gardens she would have fined them for. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. For years, she had dictated aesthetics. What colors, what flags, what flowers. But now, the neighborhood bloomed in rebellion. Every painted mailbox, every unfined lawn was a statement of quiet defiance. My wife said it best one evening as she watched the lights of a backyard barbecue flicker across the street. She thought she was protecting order. All she ever did was kill joy. The county prosecutor eventually confirmed that Karen's plea deal came with a full ban on serving in any administrative capacity for homeowner organizations. It was poetic. She'd spent her life chasing titles, and now she wasn't legally allowed to hold one again. When the news broke, people cheered. I mean literally cheered. Someone even left a cardboard crown at the entrance of the old HOA office with a sign that read, "Queen Karen's reign is over." It was childish, sure, but somehow fitting. For a woman who built her world on dominance, humiliation was the one language she never expected to learn. I remember the day they came to remove the old HOA signage from the gate. It was a gray morning, the kind of day that would have once had Karen complaining about property presentation. I stood there with a few neighbors as the letters were unbolted one by one. There was a strange silence in the air. Not sadness, not celebration, just the feeling of an era ending. Someone said softly, "Feels like we finally got our neighborhood back." My wife didn't say anything. She just folded her arms, nodded once, and watched as the final letter clattered to the ground. That night, we had dinner with Greg and his wife, neighbors who had moved away years ago because of Karen's harassment. They'd come back just to see the aftermath. We sat around the table laughing about the absurdity of it all, the fake citations, the clipboard inspections, the endless passive-aggressive emails about non-compliant lawn decor. Greg raised his glass and said, "You two didn't just beat her, you exposed her." My wife smiled faintly, that same calm, restrained satisfaction she always carried. "I didn't expose her," she said. "She exposed herself. I just turned on the light." Weeks passed, but the sense of justice didn't fade. I'd catch myself walking past the gate at dusk, hearing only the sound of the wind instead of Karen's voice echoing through the neighborhood. It was strange how silence could feel like victory. The HOA office, once the epicenter of her control, sat empty now. The windows were dark, the mailbox overstuffed with unopened letters. Every time I passed it, I thought about how easy it is for people like her to mistake fear for respect. They think authority means control, but real authority, earned authority, means accountability. Then came the letter from the county's restitution office. Karen's assets were being liquidated to repay residents for fraudulent fines. Every household that had been targeted would receive compensation. It wasn't much in dollars, but it meant something far more valuable. Validation. Proof that they weren't crazy, that they hadn't imagined the injustice. When I handed the envelope to Mr. Lawson down the street, the old veteran who'd once been fined for flying his flag, he just stared at it for a moment, then said quietly, "She can't take this one away." His hands shook slightly as he opened it, and I realized this wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. By the time spring rolled around, the neighborhood didn't even resemble the one Karen had ruled. Kids played in driveways again. Neighbors waved instead of whispering. And for the first time, community meant something real. My wife and I would sit outside in the evenings, sipping coffee, the fading sunlight turning everything gold. She'd glance at me sometimes with that knowing look, the one that said she'd already moved on from the chaos. "You know," she said one night, "people like her always come back in some form. Different faces, same arrogance." I nodded. "Then I guess we'll be ready." She smirked. "Always." It wasn't revenge that made the ending satisfying. It was balance. The world had simply corrected itself. Power, when abused, always collapses under its own weight. Karen's mistake wasn't just crossing legal lines, it was believing she could rewrite them. And when she tried to bring false authority to our door, she learned the hard way that real authority doesn't shout, doesn't threaten. It just acts. It walks in quietly, shows the badge, and lets the truth do the rest. Sometimes I think about the first night it all began. The knock on the door, the fake badges, the arrogance in Karen's voice. If I hadn't seen through it, if my wife hadn't stepped forward, who knows how far she would have gone. But in the end, she wrote her own downfall, and all it took was one real badge to expose every fake one she'd ever waved. That's how it always goes with people like her. They build kingdoms on fear and lies, and then crumble the moment truth shows up unannounced. Now the porch light glows each night, steady and calm. My wife still keeps her badge in the same place, hanging by the door, not as a warning but as a quiet reminder that authority without integrity means nothing. Every time I pass it, I think about Karen, about how loud she once was, and how silent she is now. Because in the end, the truth didn't just win, it outlasted her. And for the first time since we moved here, the sound of peace feels permanent. Months passed, and the echoes of Karen's downfall still lingered through the neighborhood like a ghost that everyone could finally talk about. The grass had grown back where her fake inspection patrols used to park. The gates that once felt like prison bars now stood open, and the community she'd ruled through fear was starting to heal in small human ways. People began to greet each other again, waving instead of glancing over their shoulders. Porch lights stayed on longer. Barbecues replaced HOA meetings. It was as if a shadow had lifted, one forged from years of intimidation and false authority. My wife and I watched it all unfold quietly, from the same porch where everything had begun, her badge gleaming faintly against the wall beside us. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It lingers, slow and patient, reminding everyone that it's not just about winning, it's about restoring balance. I still remember the day the county officials showed up to inventory the old HOA office for auction. The building was stripped bare. The files, the binders, even the ridiculous compliance posters Karen loved to display. All gone. Only dust and silence remained. A man from the county asked if I wanted to keep any of the signs for sentimental reasons. I told him the only thing worth keeping was peace. He laughed, but it wasn't a joke. That small office had been her empire, a stage where she performed authority she never truly had. Watching it empty out was like watching an old illusion dissolve. Power built on lies always ends in silence. Later that week, Karen's sentencing was televised. I didn't intend to watch it, but the screen was already glowing when I came into the room. She stood before the judge, looking smaller than she ever had in person. No more sunglasses, no floral blazer, just gray fabric and fear. The same woman who once called herself the backbone of the community couldn't even meet the camera's eye. The prosecutor laid it all out: impersonation, fraud, harassment, conspiracy, and when the judge finally handed down her sentence, the courtroom went still. 5 years. No chance of early parole. The sound of the gavel echoed through the speakers, sharp and final. My wife didn't smile, didn't even nod. She just said quietly, "That's what accountability sounds like." It wasn't long before new families started moving into the neighborhood, people who'd heard about the story but didn't know the weight of what came before it. They saw green lawns and open fences, but they didn't see the years of tension that had come before. Sometimes they'd ask about the HOA incident, curious about the rumor. I'd tell them the truth, but simply. A woman tried to control everyone, I'd say, and forgot that some people can't be controlled. That was enough. The legend of HOA Karen became something of a warning. A story passed from neighbor to neighbor about what happens when someone mistakes power for law. My wife returned fully to her federal work after that, but her presence still anchored the community in ways she didn't even realize. The neighbors trusted her now, not because of her badge, but because of her integrity. They'd stop her on her morning jogs to ask about property rights, privacy, how to handle leftover HOA fees. She never flaunted her credentials. She just helped. Quietly, efficiently, like she always had. It was strange how Karen's chaos had left behind something almost good. A new kind of unity, one not based on fear, but respect. One evening, months later, I caught my wife standing at the fence line, staring toward the spot where Karen used to confront us. The air was still, heavy with late summer warmth. "You thinking about her?" I asked. She didn't look away. "Not her," she said. "Just the idea of her. People like that. There'll always be more." I stepped beside her, hands in my pockets. "Then there'll always be people like you," I said. She smiled faintly, the kind that doesn't need words. "Let's hope so," she murmured. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest memories, but some moments stay crisp no matter how much dust they collect. Every once in a while, I'll find one of Karen's old notices tucked between the pages of a file I forgot to throw away. Her sharp, red handwriting scolding us for something absurd like improper lawn alignment. I don't get angry anymore, I just laugh, because those letters don't mean anything now. They're relics of a world that doesn't exist anymore, a kingdom she built on threats and paperwork, erased by one act of truth. Now, when the wind moves through the trees in the evening, carrying the hum of sprinklers and the faint sound of children playing, I realize something simple but profound. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It just waits for the right moment to reveal itself. Karen tried to weaponize fear, but fear is fragile when faced with someone who refuses to bow to it. She thought the badge she forged would scare us into submission. She didn't count on meeting a real one, and not just a badge made of metal, but one forged in conviction. Sometimes, when people hear the story, they ask if I miss the thrill of that day, the confrontation, the adrenaline, the shock of watching power crumble. I tell them no. What I miss is the silence right after, the moment the cruiser pulled away and the neighborhood exhaled for the first time. That sound, that stillness, was worth more than any revenge could ever give. It meant the storm had passed. It meant we'd survived it with our integrity intact. Now, when I lock the door each night, I don't do it out of fear. I do it out of habit. Because this home isn't just a house anymore. It's proof that you can't fake authority, you can't manufacture justice, and you can't scare people who've already learned what real power looks like. My wife's badge still hangs by the door, the metal dulled slightly by time, but every time the light catches it, I remember that day. The pounding on the door, the fake uniforms, Karen's smug grin turning to terror. And I remember the words my wife said afterward, as simple and final as a verdict. Real power doesn't need to shout, it just stands there and lets the truth do the work. That truth still stands, unshaken, even now. And for the first time in a long time, peace doesn't feel borrowed. It feels earned. Winter came early that year, and with it came a strange calm that settled over the neighborhood like fresh snow. The air carried a different kind of quiet, one that wasn't rooted in fear or compliance, but peace. The fences once patrolled by Karen's imaginary enforcers were now strung with lights, the same homes she'd fined for excessive decoration, glowing in defiance. I'd stand at the window sometimes, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood come alive again. It wasn't the kind of perfection Karen had demanded. It was messy, loud, and real. The sound of laughter had replaced the echo of threats. For the first time since we'd moved there, it actually felt like a community. My wife was the same as always, steady, grounded, sharp. She never bragged about what happened. She didn't talk about the takedown, didn't dwell on it like a victory. She just carried on, as though it had been one more problem to solve, one more loose end tied off. Her badge stayed on the hook by the door, polished but untouched, a quiet symbol of everything that moment stood for. Sometimes, when I caught her looking at it, there was something unspoken in her eyes. It wasn't pride. It was clarity. A kind of unshakable knowledge that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Karen had stepped over one of those lines, and justice had simply followed its natural course. In time, the neighborhood became something of a legend in nearby towns. The story spread. The HOA that collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, the president who tried to impersonate the law, and the federal agent who ended it all with nothing more than a badge and an unflinching stare. People would drive through sometimes, curious to see the place where it happened. They'd slow down at the end of our street, whispering to each other as if they could still feel the ghost of Karen's authority lingering in the pavement. But all they'd find was a quiet row of homes and the sound of normal life. It's funny how quickly legends fade when there's no one left to feed them. Karen's house sat empty for months. The grass grew wild, vines curling over the porch she used to stand on like a throne. Eventually, a young couple bought it, didn't even know the history. The day they moved in, I saw them hanging a small flag by the door, smiling as they waved to the neighbors. For a second, I wondered what Karen would have said if she could see it. Probably something about community standards. My wife just smiled when I mentioned it. "The only standard worth having," she said, "is freedom." As the seasons turned, life carried on with the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. The HOA sign at the front of the neighborhood had long been taken down, replaced with a simple wooden post that read, "Welcome home." No logos, no rules, no oversight. Just a message that meant exactly what it said. People still joked about Karen sometimes, her clipboard, her fines, the absurdity of her power. But mostly they just lived. Kids rode bikes past the spot where the fake cops once parked. Neighbors traded vegetables from gardens she would have outlawed. Every small act of normalcy felt like a rebellion that didn't need to be declared. One evening, I found myself walking down to the lake at the edge of the property. The water was still, the last light of day stretching across it in long, golden streaks. I remembered the chaos of that night, the fake badges, the shouting, the sound of my wife's calm voice cutting through the madness. And I realized something that had taken me months to understand. What made her so powerful wasn't the badge at all. It was her composure, her ability to see through fear, through ego, through everything Karen had built, and meet it with truth. Real authority doesn't come from symbols or titles. It comes from knowing you don't need them. When I turned back toward the house, the lights were on, warm and soft against the cold. My wife was inside, setting out 2 mugs like she always did, one for her, one for me. As I walked up the path, I thought about all the people still living under someone like Karen somewhere else. People who didn't know yet that they could stand up, that they could say no. That power without integrity always collapses eventually. Maybe that's why these stories matter. Not because they're dramatic, but because they remind people what happens when you stop being afraid of false authority. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and cinnamon. My wife looked up as I came in, smiling faintly. "Cold out there?" she asked. "Not as cold as it used to be," I said. She laughed softly and handed me the mug. We stood there for a while, not needing to talk. The world outside had moved on, but the lesson lingered. Real power doesn't demand obedience. It earns respect. And fear, no matter how loud, always folds under the quiet weight of truth. Later that night, I stepped back outside, watching the stars blink over the rooftops. The porch light cast a steady glow on the badge hanging by the door, its metal edges catching the light. It wasn't just a symbol of what happened. It was a reminder of what we refused to become. Karen had used fear as her weapon. My wife used integrity as her armor. And in the end, integrity always wins. The world doesn't need more people pretending to be powerful. It needs more people willing to stand up when it matters and let the truth speak for itself. As the night deepened and the cold settled in, I took one last look at the quiet street before going inside. No sirens, no shouting, no pounding on the door. Just peace. The kind that doesn't have to announce itself. The kind that stays. By spring, the neighborhood had rewritten its own story. The lawns once patrolled by Karen's imaginary authority were now alive with color. Kids ran barefoot across the grass, dogs barked freely, and no one cared if someone left their trash bins out a day late. The fear that had once clung to this place had evaporated, replaced by something Karen could never manufacture. Trust. The people she'd ruled through intimidation had quietly built something real in her absence. Community, the way it was supposed to be. Messy, human, free. From the porch, I'd watch them wave to each other, borrowing tools, sharing food, laughing in the open. This wasn't the sterile perfection Karen wanted. This was life. The kind that doesn't need permission. It had been nearly a year since she was led away in handcuffs, and yet her shadow lingered only in stories. Every so often, a new family would move in, unaware of the chaos that once defined this place, and an old neighbor would tell them about the time the HOA president tried to send fake cops to a federal agent's house. The story always started with disbelief and ended with admiration. They ran, the newcomers would ask. Oh, they ran, the old ones would say, chuckling. Over time, it became less about Karen herself and more about what the neighborhood had learned from her, that fear only works until someone calls its bluff. Karen's former allies disappeared into the background. Those who once sat beside her at meetings now pretended they'd never agreed with her. The HOA records, what remained of them, were archived and sealed. My wife was asked several times to speak at community legal panels about the incident, to share how she handled it so cleanly. She refused every time. She didn't want credit. She just wanted peace. The badge still hung by the door, not as a warning, but as a quiet reminder that justice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to exist. One evening, we hosted a neighborhood dinner, something that would have been unthinkable when Karen was in charge. Long tables lined the street, draped with mismatched tablecloths and glowing under strings of lights. Music played softly, kids chased each other through the grass, and for the first time in years, no one was watching over their shoulder. My wife walked among the tables, smiling, talking to people, laughing at small jokes. She wasn't Agent Marshall to them anymore. She was just the woman who'd made sure no one had to be afraid again. And that meant more than any title ever could. Later that night, after the crowd dispersed, we stood together under the same oak tree where Karen once screamed about property violations. The air was still, the smell of barbecue and laughter still lingering. "You ever think she'll come back?" I asked. My wife looked out at the dark horizon, her expression unreadable. "People like her never really go away," she said. "They just find new places to hide." I studied her face in the dim light, calm, steady, certain. "Then I guess we'll be here when they do," I said. She nodded once, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. "Always." The next morning I found an envelope taped to our mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside was a short note written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us couldn't." Beneath it was a faded HOA notice. One of Karen's old violation letters, the ink barely legible. Someone had crossed out the word violation and written freedom in its place. I don't know who left it, but I didn't need to. It was proof that what happened wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about reclaiming the right to live without fear. Life settled into its new rhythm after that. My wife worked her cases, and I managed the property like always. Sometimes we'd get visitors, journalists, lawyers, even other HOA victims asking for advice. My wife never lectured. She just told them the same simple thing. Don't confuse confidence with power. One's earned, the other's borrowed. It became something of a motto, not just for her, but for the entire community. Every time someone faced an injustice, those words carried through the neighborhood like a quiet warning to anyone who tried to overstep. Years later, the county recognized our neighborhood as one of the most independent communities in the state. Self-governed, HOA-free, united by mutual respect. No one had imagined that the chaos Karen unleashed would end up forging something better. It was poetic in a way, the collapse of false authority giving rise to genuine unity. My wife once said that corruption always overplays its hand, that evil isn't clever, it's arrogant. And she was right. Karen thought she could impersonate power, but real power doesn't need a stage. It simply stands, unyielding, until lies dissolve in its presence. As I look out now, years later, the porch light still casts its soft glow across the front steps, illuminating the badge hanging on the wall. Time has dulled the metal, but not the meaning. It stands as a silent monument to everything we endured and everything we reclaimed. Every time I see it, I remember the pounding on the door, the fear, the lies, and the calm voice that ended it all with a single quiet truth. You can't fake real authority. That truth still lives here, in the laughter, the quiet nights, the open gates. It's not a story about revenge anymore. It's a story about restoration, about what happens when decency outlasts deceit. This isn't just the ending of one fight. It's the legacy of what followed. The world outside moved on, but this street remains living proof that integrity, once tested, only grows stronger. Real authority doesn't need to dominate, it protects. It doesn't threaten, it restores. And sometimes, all it takes to expose every lie in the room is one woman standing quietly, holding the truth in her hand.